In the corporate propaganda of today, they promise net zero carbon emissions in their net zero carbon emissions pledge. Now, let's take a look at practical methods and operations that have been carried out with this goal in mind. Project 112 was a biological and chemical weapon experimentation project conducted by the United States Department of Defense from 1962 to 1973, according to Wikipedia, and allegedly, Project 112 was concerned with the use of aerosols to disseminate biological and chemical agents that could produce controlled temporary incapacitation. Now let's look at an element of this Project 112 in Project SHAD, which is allegedly an acronym for Shipboard Hazard and Defense, and was carried out in the 1960s, and it was done against U.S. warships. Unbeknownst to the military members involved, they were being experimented upon. Now, Project SHAD was part of Project 112, as stated before, and lo and behold, the CIA was intricately involved with it from 1962 to 1973, which is not too long ago. And as said before, it was conducted against service members aboard military ships. And this, of course, is knowledgeable. And of course, we have knowledge about this because of the declassification of classified operations. And this says roughly 5,500 veterans took part or were aware of the tests. To what level of awareness they have is suspect, of course, but whoever wrote this article is clearly attempting to run a cover story for this operation and explain it or diminish it from its true purpose. But a large number of veterans on these testing sites were unaware of what was going on and are probably still being experimented on today without their knowledge, because if they did it once, they would certainly do it again. But as we will see in further portions of this video, they did it far more than once and have admitted to such. But some locations of SHAD tests were in the Pacific Ocean, Fort Sherman, and Hawaii, among others. Now, some of the ships involved include the USS Berkeley, Carpenter, Fechtheller, Fort Snelling, George Eastman, and many others, including many Army tugboats. And also, air units were tested upon. But then we'll look at Operation Sea Spray. And according to the USA Inquirer, between 1949 and 1969, the U.S. Army conducted 239 secret bacterial warfare tests. In various cities across the country. While this seems like another one of those crazy conspiracies, it's true. Another one of those crazy conspiracies. I wonder what the bias or perspective of this writer could possibly be. Perhaps CIA. It wasn't until the trial in 1977 that the Army admitted to staging many mock biological attacks on and unbeknownst to American citizens. Yeah, I'm sure the Army admitted to that, as if every soldier in the Army was responsible for this, and it's the Army that did it, not, individuals in certain positions of so-called authority. Anyway, some of these experiments use live bacteria assumed to be harmless, including Serratia marcescens, I don't actually know what that is. And anthrax stimulants. Now, I don't know about you, but it has been well known in the past, at least as we're taught, that anthrax is not assumed to be harmless and never was assumed to be harmless. And then, of course, it gives an explanation of what the purpose of these were. Whether or not that explanation is true is not important, because the explanation is intended to explain away that particular event. But during the trial, the Army insisted that the tests had no adverse side effects on the American public. Yeah, okay. Anthrax would have no adverse side effects. Sure. But in continuation, the mock attack, very, very mocking, yes indeed, on San Francisco was one of many. The Army initiated similar experiments in Washington, New York, Key West, Panama City, Alaska, and Pennsylvania. Of course, this is part of this specific operation. And tests were also performed on several bases around the country, housing military members and their families. Some of these stimulants took place in airports, turnpikes, bus stations, and subways. The airport mock attack test was initiated by carrying briefcases around the terminal as they sprayed bacteria. In the subway, light bulbs filled with Bacillus subtilis were dropped to spread the bacteria. Of course, one wonders how they spread the anthrax, but this is the government specifically carrying out, or at least members of the government and probably higher up, and likely CIA connected to the Vatican, the UN, the usual culprits, doing exactly what they preach to us to watch out for among specifically Arab terrorists, as their stereotypical propaganda presented it. But then we also look at Operation Do. This is also according to Wikipedia. And it refers to two separate field trials conducted by the United States in the 50s. And these are specifically related to aerosol-released biological agents. Operation Do 1 consisted of separate trials from 1952 until, March 1952 to April. And they were designed to test the feasibility of maintaining large aerosol cloud released offshore until it drifted over land, achieving a large area coverage. The tests released zinc cadmium sulfide. Now, in another operation, we will be looking at zinc cadmium sulfide, and that is Operation LAC, which they say is large area coverage, but some of us might know it as location area code, being relative to your phone number. And they dispersed microscopic zinc cadmium sulfide particles. So what is exactly this zinc cadmium sulfide? Well, it is toxic, and repeated exposures or long-term exposures are expected to have harmful effects on the kidneys, bones, and respiratory tract, resulting in kidney impairment, osteoporosis, bone weakness, and chronic inflammation of the respiratory tract. That sounds like many issues that people have today in certain parts of the United States. And then Operation White Coat was a biodefense medical research program carried out by the United States at Fort Detrick, Maryland between 1954 and 1973. It's interesting they don't label this as an experiment or test and call it a program, but the program pursued medical research using volunteer enlisted personnel who were eventually nicknamed White Coats. Of course, they are very liberal with this use of the word volunteer, because I highly doubt most of them volunteered for this program, but it says that they included members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, were informed of the purpose and goals of each project before providing consent to participate in any project. Of course, one wonders how many exactly were informed of the purpose and in what way they were informed of it. Anyway, the stated purpose of the research was to defend troops and civilians against biological weapons, and it was believed that the Soviet Union was engaged in similar activities. And of course, it's probably what they told the people that were used in the experiments. But the program was discontinued in 1973, which of course coincides with the end of the draft. So this particular operation relates to the draft and conscientious objectors. And as we see, it was discontinued in 1973 when the draft for the U.S. military ended. And there were no conscientious objectors to be used and abused. Then we look at some of the more insidious and disturbing and also irritating of the operations, and that is Operation Big Itch, rightly named, and Operation Dropkick, where fleas and infected mosquitoes were dropped over black towns. Of course, they were dropped over many other types of towns too. And then this was posted by Injustice's J. Jones, March 16, 2021. Operation Big Itch and Operation Dropkick, the Corps explored the feasibility of using fleas and mosquitoes as weapons. And then, of course, this is known because of the declassification of certain government documents. And this is naturally is in around the 1950s area, but they released 600,000 uninfected mosquitoes, allegedly uninfected. Perhaps some of them were infected and others weren't, so they could give the uninfected number. But within a day, the mosquitoes had spread a distance of between 1 and 2 miles and had bitten many people. Yeah, well, that's what mosquitoes do. But that goes to show you that they are likely breeding, but certainly releasing populations of mosquitoes, which is highly irritating. But then a similar operation took place in Georgia, and that was called Operation Big Buzz, 1955. And this operation spread yellow fever infected mosquitoes. So here we get an admittance to the infection of mosquitoes and releasing of infected mosquitoes with yellow fever specifically. And then Operation Big Buzz was in Georgia in 1955, as said. And this Wikipedia article states that the previous one wasn't Wikipedia, but this one is Wikipedia, and it states that it was 300,000 mosquitoes. Of course, one wonders where they're getting that number from. And then we also look at Operation Mayday, and this also involves yellow fever mosquitoes dropped into urban areas, one specifically in Savannah, Georgia. And this was declassified allegedly in 1981. Well, it was partially declassified and likely recently more declassified so that people would know what it was really about. Then we look at Operation Cauldron, which was a series of secret biological warfare trials undertaken by the British, showing a clear international connection to this overall operation. And they released biological agents including pneumonic and bubonic plague, brucellosis, and tularemia, and testing the effect of the agents on cage monkeys and guinea pigs. Of course, this does say that they were releasing the biological agents, and at the end they talk about cage monkeys and guinea pigs, which appears to be an attempt to diminish it and not say that the British government was literally trying to poison people in the public. Operation Polka Dot was a U.S. Army test of a biological cluster bomb during the 1950s. And then we go down to this, we find a similar culprit, Bacillus globigii. However, when we look at Operation Dew and Polka Dot, we can read between the lines and expect that they were probably conducting other things under these operation names. As with Dew, direct energy weapon is likely where that comes from, and it's possible that it is not actually, or possibly not just biological, but also energy based. Now, Operation Top Hat in 1953, this was a chemical, biological, and radiological testing and research. Well, that's convenient. And this, of course, was done against human subjects and included vesicants and phosgene and other nerve agents. And of course, those are, for anyone who has any experience with nerve agents, those are pretty nasty ones. And then Operation Vegetarian was going back to the British. was allegedly a plan to disseminate linseed cakes infected with anthrax into Germany, and they state that this was not happened, of course, and fed to cattle. Of course, this could be the culprit for mad cow disease and many other events in the United States, perhaps even the dying off of cattle and the need for Texas Longhorns to repopulate the cattle population in the United States for a while. Of course, that's old history. And it's possible that the linseed cakes weren't dispersed into Germany, but instead were dispersed somewhere else, like the United States, shall we say. And then when we look at Operation Whitewash, this operation is where we find the culprit for melting ice caps. And it involves the use of a laser beam to melt the ice in, I believe, Pakistan, part of the Kali project from India, and it's designed to cause an avalanche, allegedly. Now, if you believe that it's the government that is the problem and that they're incredibly evil and the source of all of this, then let us look at some other examples of human experimentation and the practical application that most levels of society are designed to carry out this net zero carbon emissions. We look at the Sonoma State Hospital in Northern California. This is a particularly disturbing case from 1955 to 60. This served as a permanent drop-off location for mentally disabled children diagnosed with cerebral palsy or lesser disorders. Like that one there, lesser disorders. The children subsequently underwent painful experimentation without adult consent or probably awareness either. Many were given spinal taps for which they received no direct benefit. Reporters of 60 Minutes learned that in these 5 years, the brain of every child with cerebral palsy who died at Sonoma State was removed and studied without parental consent. Of course, I'm sure most of them were studied upon and experimented on while they were alive. And of course, it also seems like that article is attempting to diminish and obfuscate the evilness of that program. And then when we go and look at the unethical experimentation in the United States page in Wikipedia, we find the Center for Disease Control, United States Military and Central Intelligence Agency as the blamed culprits, when in fact it's more of a global cabal, if you will, of corrupt people that wish to destroy humanity. And they have faces and names which they won't disclose because then somebody could do something about them. So now it's the CIA and the faceless military and the government, which you can't hold accountable because it's not a human person and doesn't bleed. Then the Holmesburg program from approximately 1951 to 74. Holmesburg Prison in Pennsylvania was a site of dermatological research operation. And they used prisoners, and then Dr. Albert M. Kliegman, allegedly, of the University of Pennsylvania. And they were performed on behalf of companies and the U.S. Army and Johnson & Johnson, more juridic people that you can't hold accountable. You can only take them to court and get a settlement, as we've found. Anyway, they used dioxin and herbicides and tested their effects against skin. And they used a test of chloroquine, and they showed that they suffered from various health problems, including lupus and psychological damage. So essentially, they tested and understood the negative effects of using pesticides, which does appear to be what the case is here, and went ahead and approved pesticides anyway. And of course, most things are sprayed with pesticides nowadays, which is the reason why you itch if you roll around in the grass at a park or whatnot. Anyway, then we look at Edgewood Arsenal human experiments, which is relatively famous and well known. And this includes a long list of different objects that are well known and admitted to, and that's of course because this particular project had a lot of, shall we say, controversy around it and lawsuits and whatnot. Anyway, they used nerve agents, VX sarin, and of course one certain dictator in the Middle East was accused of using sarin, while our government, which was telling us to worry about that dictator in the Middle East, was in fact using sarin on us, including organophosphorus and carbonate pesticides and more pesticides. Mustard agents, nerve agent antidotes, including atropine and scopolamine. In August 2010, U.S. weapons manufacturer Raytheon announced that it partnered with a jail in Castaic, California, to use prisoners as test subjects for its active denial system. And that, of course, appears to relate to microwave weaponry and things like that that are intended to cause pain so that people become incapacitated or neutralized. And in 1939, at the Iowa Soldiers Orphans Home, that's certainly not a creepy name, Davenport, Iowa, 22 children were the subjects of the so-called monster experiment. This experiment attempted to use psychological abuse to induce stuttering in children who spoke normally. This experiment was designed by Dr. Wendell Johnson, one of the nation's most prominent speech pathologists, for the purpose of testing one of his theories on the cause of stuttering. Yeah, that doesn't sound like explaining away anti-human project. In 1961, in response to the Nuremberg trials, the Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram performed his obedience to authority study, also known as the Milgram experiment, to determine if it was possible that the Nazi genocide could have resulted from millions of people who were just following orders. Of course, this person is probably a Nazi, allegedly doing this for the purposes of Nazi genocide, and that is called a lie. Anyway, the Milgram experiment raised questions about the ethics of scientific experimentation. Yeah, raised questions about the ethics of scientific experimentation. As if those questions hadn't already been raised by the Nazi human experimentation that is allegedly well documented as taking place in Germany and other Nazi-controlled places. And this specifically related to electroshock therapy. But in 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo conducted the Stanford prison experiment, in which 24 male students were randomly assigned to roles of prisoners and guards in a mock prison situation in the basement of Stanford Psychology Building. And of course, that particular event is relatively famous. We don't really need to cover that one very much. Then, from 1946 to 53, the Walter E. Fernald State School of Massachusetts, in an experiment sponsored by the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission and the Quaker Oats Corporation, 73 mentally disabled children were fed oatmeal containing radioactive calcium and other radioisotopes, allegedly to track how nutrients were digested. More like to test the effects that lacing their oatmeal would have on consumers. That's not bad faith business. Well, it's worse than bad faith business, but the University of California Hospital in San Francisco exposed 29 patients, some with rheumatoid arthritis, to total body irradiation, 100 to 300 rad dose, to obtain, allegedly, to obtain data for the military. How convenient. In the 1950s, researchers at the Medical College of Virginia performed experiments on severe burn victims, most of them poor and black, without their knowledge or consent, with funding from the Army and in collaboration with the AEC. It's rather convenient that it's the Army doing it. The massive entity has no face or body. And I don't know what the AEC is. In the experiments, the subjects were exposed to additional burning experimental antibiotic treatment and injections of radioactive isotopes. The amount of radioactive phosphorus-32 injected into some of the patients, 500 microcuries, 19 mbq, was 50 times the acceptable dose for a healthy individual. For people with severe burns, this likely led to a significant increased death rates. That is called murder. But between 1948 and 54, funded by the federal government, researchers at the Johns Hopkins Hospital inserted radium rods into the noses of 582 Baltimore, Maryland school children as an alternative to adenodectomy. Makes you wonder about the tests, but similar experiments were performed on over 7,000 U.S. Army and Navy personnel during World War II. Nasal radium irradiation became a standard medical treatment and was used in over 2.5 million Americans. In another study at the Walter E. Fernald State School in 1956, researchers gave mentally disabled children radioactive calcium orally and intravenously. They also injected radioactive chemicals into malnourished babies and then collected cerebrospinal fluid for analysis from their brains and spines. This does not sound like something that human beings would do to other human beings, but it's plainly admitted to. In 1961 and 62, 10 Utah State prison inmates had blood samples taken, which were mixed with radioactive chemicals and re-injected back into their bodies. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission funded the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to administer radium-224 and thorium-234 to 20 people between 1961 and 1965. Many were chosen from the Age Center of New England and volunteered for research projects on aging. Doses were 0.2 to 2.4 microcuries, 7.4 to 88.8 kbq for radium, and 1.2 to 120 microcuries, 44 to 4,440 kbq for thorium. In a 1967 study that was published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, pregnant women were injected with radioactive cortisol to see if it would cross the placental barrier and affect the fetus. That sounds like an attempt to abort without the mother's knowledge. And people still take their children and give birth in hospitals. Psychological and torture experiments. U.S. government research. The United States government funded and performed numerous psychological experiments, especially during the Cold War era. Many of these experiments were performed to help develop more effective torture and interrogation techniques for the U.S. military and intelligence agencies. At least that is the stated purpose. That's called public relations. And to develop techniques for Americans to resist torture at the hands of enemy nations and organizations. In studies running from 1947 to 1953, which were known as Project Chatter, the U.S. Navy identifying and testing truth serums, which they had hoped could be used during interrogations of Soviet spies. Some of the chemicals tested on human subjects included mescaline and anticholinergic drug scopolamine. Shortly thereafter, in 1950, the CIA initiated Project Bluebird, later renamed Project Artichoke, whose stated purpose was to develop the means to control individuals through special interrogation techniques. Ways to prevent extraction of information from CIA agents, and offensive uses of unconventional techniques such as hypnosis and drugs. The purpose of this project was outlined in a memo dated January 1952 that stated, "Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation?" Project studied the use of hypnosis, forced morphine addiction, and subsequent forced withdrawal, and the use of other chemicals among other methods to produce amnesia and other vulnerable states in subjects in order to perfect techniques for the abstraction of information from individuals, whether willing or not. Project Bluebird researchers experimented with a wide variety of psychotropic substances, including LSD, heroin, marijuana, cocaine, PCP, mescaline, and ether. Project Bluebird researchers dosed over 7,000 U.S. military personnel with LSD without their knowledge and consent at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. And of course, those are just the numbers that they will admit to. But this project has a considerable overlap with a Operation Midnight Climax, which appears to have been conducting a similar vein of so-called testing. And then when we look at plutonium experiments from April 10, 1945 to 1947, 18 people were injected with plutonium as part of the Manhattan Project. And then of course there's more examples of plutonium experiments in this part. Then we look at experiments involving other radioactive materials. And then after World War II, researchers at Vanderbilt University, no surprise that name there, gave 829 pregnant mothers in Tennessee what they were told were vitamin drinks that would improve the health of their babies. The mixtures contained radioactive iron, and the researchers were determining how fast the radioisotope crossed into the placenta. 4 of the women's babies died from cancer as a result of the experiments, and the women experienced rashes, bruises, anemia, hair/tooth loss, and cancer. Yeah, that sounds pretty evil. Now, pharmacological research. At Harvard University, no surprise, in the late 1940s, researchers began performing experiments on which they tested diethylstilbestrol, a synthetic estrogen, on pregnant women at the Lying Hospital, that's ironically named, of the University of Chicago. The women experienced an abnormally high number of miscarriages and babies with low birth weight. That's called murder and forced abortion. None of the women were told they were being experimented on. 1962, researchers at the Laurel Children's Center in Maryland tested experimental acne medications on children. They continued their tests even after half of the children developed severe liver damage from the medications. Of course. In 2004, University of Minnesota research participant Dan Markinson died by suicide. That's convenient. While enrolled in an industry-sponsored pharmaceutical trial comparing 3 FDA-approved atypical antipsychotics, Seroquel, Zyprexa, olanzapine, and risperidone. Now, looking at some historical examples. Well, one is really a historical example. In 1846, journals of Walter F. Jones of Petersburg, Virginia, described how he poured boiling water on the backs of slaves afflicted with typhoid pneumonia at 4-hour intervals. And then, of course, this is explained as he thought this might cure the disease by stimulating the capillaries, as that's likely. In 1942, the Harvard University biochemist Edwin Joseph Kahn injected 64 Massachusetts prisoners with cow blood as part of an experiment sponsored by the U.S. Navy. I wonder if there's additions to that cow blood. And in 1950, researchers at the Cleveland City Hospital ran experiments to study changes in cerebral blood flow. They injected people with spinal anesthesia and inserted needles into their jugular veins and brachial arteries to extract large quantities of blood. And after massive blood loss, which caused paralysis and fainting, measured their blood pressure. The experiment was often performed multiple times on the same subject. In a series of studies which were published in the medical journal Pediatrica, researchers from the University of California Department of Pediatrics performed experiments on 113 newborns ranging in age from 1 hour to 3 days, which they studied changes in blood pressure and blood flow. In one of the studies, researchers inserted a catheter through the baby's umbilical arteries and into their aortas, and then submerged their feet in ice water. In another of the studies, they strapped 50 newborn babies to a circumcision board and turned them upside down so that all of their blood rushed into their heads. And of course, that is what's admitted to I imagine there's some worse things that they don't want to even admit to. The San Antonio contraceptive study was a clinical research study published in 1971 about side effects of oral contraceptives. Women coming to a clinic in San Antonio, Texas to prevent pregnancies were not told they were participating in a research study or receiving placebos. 10 of the women became pregnant while on placebos. During the decade of 2000 to 2010, artificial blood was transferred into research subjects across the United States without their consent by Northfield Labs. Later studies showed the artificial blood caused a significant increase in the risk of heart attacks and death. In the 2010s, Facebook breached ethical guidelines. The ethics of it. Not whether or not it's murder or abortion, but whether or not it's ethical. 1954, the CIA's Project QK Hilltop was created to study Chinese brainwashing techniques and to develop effective methods of interrogation. Most of the early studies are believed to have been performed by the Cornell University Medical School's Human Ecology Study programs under the direction of Dr. Harold Wolff. I bet that was a project of Operation Paperclip, also under the CIA. Wolff requested that the CIA provide him any information they could finding regarding threats, coercion, imprisonment, deprivation, humiliation, torture, brainwashing, black psychiatry, and hypnosis, or any combination of these, with or without chemical agents. According to Wolff, the research team would then assemble, collate, analyze, and assimilate this information, and then will then undertake experimental investigations to develop new techniques of offensive or defensive intelligence use. Potentially useful secret drugs and various brain-damaging procedures will be similarly tested to ascertain the fundamental effect upon human brain function and upon the subject's mood. Where any of these studies involve potential harm of the subject, we expect the agency to make available suitable subjects and a proper place for the performance of the necessary experiments. Dr. Harold Wolff, Cornell University Medical School. And of course, doctors are still held in high regard as our current robed noblesse. No surprise that they treat us kind of like we're slaves, one might say. Another of the MK Ultra sub-projects, Operation Midnight Climax, specifically relates to the use of drugs and sex on the psychological effects of doing such without consent and all that, which was covered in a separate video. And then, of course, the usual rhetoric about whether or not it's ethical to do this stuff. Then, experiments on patients with mental illnesses. Dr. Robert Heath of Tulane University, no surprise that it's a university and a doctor, possibly as part of Operation Paperclip. Anyway, performed experiments on 42 patients with schizophrenia and prisoners in the Louisiana State Penitentiary. The experiments were funded by the U.S. Army. In the studies, he dosed them with LSD and bulbacapnine and implanted electrodes into the septal area of the brain, and etc. From 1964 to 68, the U.S. Army paid a bunch of different professors to perform experiments with mind-altering drugs on 320 inmates. And of course, this states that it was the goal to study blah blah blah, and relates to torture techniques and the use of drugs on behavioral modification and all that. Anyway, there's a long list of different. In 1966, the United States National Institutes of Health Office for Protection of blah 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 issued policies and whatnot, and a bunch of court appeals and things like that, and no one was held accountable, and so on and so forth. So, 1975, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, DHEW, created regulations which included the recommendations laid out in 1960 policies for the protection of human subjects, Title 48 Code of the Federal Regulations. And of course, all of these measures and events clearly stopped such things as operations against people without their knowledge and whatnot. 1960 to 1971, Dr. Eugene Sanger, that's an ironic last name, Funded by the Defense Atomic Support Agency, performed whole-body radiation experiments on more than 90 poor, black, advanced stage cancer patients with inoperable tumors at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center during the Cincinnati radiation experiments. He forged consent forms and did not inform the patients of the risks of irradiation. Patients were given 100 or more rads and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it makes you wonder how many other cases of that are still going on and have been done and we don't know about them. From 1963 to 1973, a leading endocrinologist, Dr. Carl Heller, irradiated the testicles of Oregon and Washington prisoners. Yeah, seen a trend here with prisoners. In return for their participation, he gave them $5 a month and $100 when they had to receive a vasectomy upon conclusion of the trial. The surgeon who sterilized the men, it doesn't sound like eugenics, said that it was necessary to keep from contaminating the general population with radiation-induced mutants. And then in 1963, the University of Washington researchers irradiated the testicles of 232 prisoners to determine the effects of radiation on testicular function. At least that is the stated purpose, but I'm sure that the real purpose was, well, eugenics. And offspring and birth defects and whatnot. And then we have fallout experiments, including Operation Plum Bob, and it's relates to thyroid cancer, Project Gabriel, and Project Sunshine, which involves the United Kingdom and Australia, and determining whether or not they can wipe out the human population with radiation and fallout and stuff. And then a baby tooth survey and some other rather creepiness. And then naturally talk about litigation and how it was, well, how the matter was settled. Yes, if you can settle murder. And then drug deaths. Harold Blower died with a fatal dose of mescaline derivative at the New York State Psychiatric Institute at Columbia University. And then, of course, the DOD and Department of Justice and other people, faceless entities or juridic people were involved. Conveniently can't hold accountable. 1953, Dr. Frank Olson. Interesting, they have a doctor who was tested upon. In 1953, the CIA placed several of its interrogation mind control programs, and yeah, it's MK Ultra. Many people know about that. And then in the 1960s, 22 elderly patients at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, New York City were injected with live cancer cells. And then this list goes on and details some other experiments done across the world, but I think we get the trend, and of course there's one important question to ask ourselves. At what point do these operations continue to be called experiments? Now, to show that we have a historical pattern here, one last note. In 1896, Dr. Arthur Wentworth performed spinal taps on 29 young children without the knowledge or consent of their parent at Children's Hospital, Boston, now Boston Children's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts, to discover whether doing so would be harmful. Of course, he would have known that would have been harmful and did it for a different purpose, but this particular case relates directly to the case in Sonoma, California, and it is a clear representation that there is no consequence when you have the right title or position in society.